Hello everyone and welcome to The Verdict. I am Spongebob 1000 and today we are going to talk about SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom Remastered, which is a 3D platformer collectathon game remastered by THQ, and in essence it's a very big throwback to 6th and 5th generation games where platformers are more or less the major type of game that was out there. By today's standards, we don't really have a lot of platformers left. There's some games like Mega Man and Sonic, and Mario is probably one of the bigger ones. But back in the good old days of the late 90s to early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, a lot of games were platformers. That was kind of like the popular style of game to make. It was fairly simple. In the advent of games like Mario 64 and Zelda Ocarina of Time, which is a little bit more action-adventure, and Donkey Kong 64 and Banjo-Kazooie, a large amount of games started to pour in that were all sort of derivatives of that. And a lot of these were mostly on Sony consoles. You had your Crash, you had your Jak and Daxter, your Sly Cooper, Ratchet and Clank, Spyro. The list just goes on and on. There's obviously some smaller ones that are lesser known. And amongst those was a single licensed title called SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom. And the reason that this game kind of remained relevant to this day is because it's sort of a cult classic in people's minds. It's sort of a diamond in the rough. Out of all the various SpongeBob games that have been made, Battle for Bikini Bottom constantly gets mentioned and brought back for one of two reasons. You're generally in one of two camps. Either you played this game when you were younger and therefore you remember it more, and you are more likely to say, hey, I remember that game when I was younger. It was fun. It was a really good game. Or you're probably in the speedrun camp, in which case you remember the game because it has a lot of interesting tech, and in general, I think the appeal of the game still relies on that heavy early 2000s nostalgia. So to give the general gist of the story, because, you know, like a lot of platformers, there really isn't too much of it. SpongeBob and Patrick are playing around one day. Plankton launches a scheme to take over the world and also to steal the Krusty Krab recipe for the Krabby Patty. And in doing so, he creates an army of evil robots who he does not set to obey his every command, so they throw him out the chum bucket. And it's your job as SpongeBob to basically take the fight to the robots and to collect golden spatulas while also freeing Bikini Bottom from the robot menace. So, very simply put, this game emulates a lot of old school platformers. You have your fairly typical spatula that you use, that you collect as like the star from Mario 64 or whatever you have from your various other games, your Spyro orbs and all those kinds of things. And there's also side collectibles like Patrick's socks, which are used to be returned for more spatulas. You find them, they're like hidden little extras. And then lastly, there are shiny things, which are basically like the jewels, the coins, the things that you need to collect and use as almost currency to unlock future levels, as well as unlock spatulas by buying them from Mr. Krabs throughout the game. A large chunk of this game is heavily rooted in the series' first 2 to 3 seasons, with some levels being taken right from episodes that had to deal with them specifically. So for instance, there's 9 different levels in this game, 3 per area, and a couple of different other side things to do. And most of them are taken either from episodes or just general backdrops from the show. So for instance, Rock Bottom is taken from an episode where SpongeBob got trapped in Rock Bottom and could not escape. Sand Mountain is also taken from an episode where he could not get where he was skiing down and doing other things there. Goo Lagoon, I think, has been shown maybe once or twice in the show. Flying Dutchman Graveyard, and all sorts of other levels. Now, the gameplay element of this game is fairly straightforward, I'd say. You have your jump, you have your attack button, which is for some characters is a spin move, or well, for SpongeBob is a spin move, and for Patrick and Sandy is a forward attack. You have abilities based on who you're playing as, because yes, like I just said, there's 3 different characters that you could play as, and in each level you play as SpongeBob and one additional character, either Sandy or Patrick. Sandy has the ability to hover, as well as use her lasso to insta-kill certain robots, and in general has a little bit more agility than Patrick, whose primary method of doing anything is to throw things, and that's more or less it. There's not very many puzzles that he really takes advantage of anything. He doesn't really offer much more besides that. Sandy definitely feels more like the platformer-esque character, I think, and I think that really kind of helps out. Now, the gameplay of the single player of this game, because there is a new multiplayer mode, is, like I said, fairly derivative from Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, and that was their intent. So, for the most part, it would play like what you'd expect from a game made in 2002, which is pretty much when this game came out. And because of that, the gameplay is fairly simple. You run through areas. The areas are, kind of linear. You run through them. They all loop on each other for the most part. And you collect spatulas either by dispatching robots, completing tasks given to you by certain characters, performing platforming challenges, solving light puzzles, the works like that. And that's all fine and all. There's not really anything wrong with that style of gameplay. It's a style of gameplay that was very popular several years ago before games really kind of took on to their own and became way more cinematic. So there's not really anything negative to say here. Besides that, the gameplay more or less focuses on some puzzles involving different abilities. Now, Spongebob is the only character that unlocks new abilities as the game goes on, and even then, he only unlocks 2 different abilities as the game progresses further and further, which I feel like maybe could have been expanded on, but for within the scope of the game, they don't really need to give you more. They give you 1 per area, which is what is typical of a game like this, so it's not really something too much to complain about. Now, for record, because I'm about to talk about the different elements of how this version performs, I played on the PC. The loading times weren't too bad for me. I've seen that on the consoles, your mileage can vary based on what console you play on. But for me, the loading times were fairly alright. I think that one of the biggest things that this game has is just a couple glitches and bugs here or there. The biggest bug I think I can find is that you cannot replay bosses after you have defeated them. And that's something I only found on my last part when I tried to do it. Once you clear a boss area, the boss is just dead forever. You can never fight them again, and teleporting into the boss area will just have you running around an empty arena that doesn't have anything in it. So there's basically 3 bosses in the game, the last of which is a 2-parter. You fight robot versions of your characters, and in that fight, you have to consistently attack them, lower their weak points, dodge their attacks, what have you. And ultimately it leads to you progressing into the next area where SpongeBob gets a new ability or beats the game. And for the last one especially, because you can't replay the ending and see, just the ending again, I think that's something that can easily be patched. But as of right now, and as of me playing this game, it has not been patched, which is a little bit annoying, and I would prefer if they kind of didn't do that. But other than that, it's still possible to 100% the game. Still possible to, if you really want to, get all the trophies and achievements without that. It's just something that would be a nice touch because it was not like that in the original version of the game. Moving beyond that, though, the other minor thing, I think, is that characters will sometimes fire off their voice lines multiple times back to back, and that could get a little bit draining. I think for the most part, the platforming isn't too glitchy. I think things are very much straightforward. I think perhaps the other big thing about it is that the robots, sometimes they have animations where they throw their missiles or something and it's not correct. But like I said, when the missile launches, it's fine. Like, there's not a big deal. But it would just be, it's little things around the edges, which is vastly different from the last game I played from THQ Nordic, which is Darksiders 3, which was a mess sometimes with glitches and variable frame rate. So for what it's worth, I feel like they have vastly improved the way that they go about making these games. And that said, I mean, the only other thing to really talk about is the presentation. I feel like the presentation of this game is amazingly well done. It's rendered in Unreal Engine. They really did a fantastic job of making you feel like you're actually watching the show. They have such great attention to detail. The grass blows in the wind. All the characters look way better. Like back in the early 2000s, they kind of looked a little bit clay-like, which kind of, again, was just how a lot of games were rendered back then. So they did a pretty good job, I'd say, of making this game look fairly good on current gen consoles, which is really all you can actually ask for and hope for. So I'm very grateful for that. I think that that's actually really awesome. The soundtrack sounds really good. I think that it definitely brings back that feeling of nostalgia, because nostalgia for not only the old version of the show, but also the style of game they're emulating is a big portion of this game. And I think they hit the nail on the head fairly nicely. The one biggest gripe I have about the game is that the multiplayer mode, which I only played a little bit of, feels very tacked on and unfinished. It doesn't even have an intro cutscene. It just is waves of robots, and that's it. They change a little bit of the rules, like some of them have more hit points or whatever, but it really seems like nobody wants to play it, and I don't blame them. It doesn't really contribute anything. It doesn't really seem that fun. It's clearly the most tacked on version of the game, and while I do give them credit for restoring cut content, I will also say that by far is it the most forgettable portion of the game that could have just been skipped over and nothing would really have been lost. But that said, one of the biggest benefits to this game that I could say is that it only costs $30. Now I got it on PC on sale for I think it was $26.79 or something like that. It was like almost 10% off, maybe, I forget. But $30 for predominantly a single player that is very fun and very well rounded out, I think is a much better deal. It's definitely something good to ask for. $25-30 is ideally, I'd say, what this game is really worth. And because of that, I always say that price should factor in to a game's review score. And I'm going to be fairly lenient because this game, while at the same time it hit all the fucking right niches in terms of platforming, it also didn't cost $60 like a lot of other remasters will or have. Usually $40 is what I'd say is the most. The Kingdom Hearts remasters, I feel, had I reviewed them, were way overpriced. $60 per one for basically two PS2 games souped up and with a little bit extra content was definitely not the way to go. That said, those games are longer, so it would be worth maybe reviewing that separately. But I feel like $30 is right on the money. You know, they figured that it's not really worth too much. The game is fairly short. I was able to beat it in only 2, maybe 3 sessions, which isn't anything spectacular. But again, that's kind of what platformers are. They're not particularly long games per se. They generally err towards the side of being shorter, but having more replayability to 100% it. So ultimately, what would I give Battle for Bikini Bottom? Well, what it has is a lot of nostalgia. It has a lot of good platforming. It has a lot of interesting puzzle solving, and towards the later parts of the game, maybe it could have had more, but that, again, that's more of a critique of the original version of the game. And for $30, I have to remember that it's way, way different than, like, say, Resident Evil 3, which wanted a full $60 for more or less the same, like, less than what you got from Resident Evil 2. So what I'm going to give Battle for Bikini Bottom is I'm going to give it an 87 out of 100. It's a fairly good game, fairly straightforward, it's enjoyable. However, the multiplayer is complete dead weight, in my opinion, and didn't really need to be added, at least not as multiplayer. I think maybe if it was like a little side single player thing, and they patched it out and they ironed down all the edges, it would be fine. But as it stands, completely forgettable mode, you don't really get anything from it. And while it's cool that it's just there for fun and for enjoyment, I also think that it really could have just not been there, or it could have been single player and it would have been better. The animations, the character lines firing off randomly or consistently, a little annoying. Nothing really to shit the bed over, but could have been done a little bit better. And lastly, patching out, being able to replay bosses, even though it's not totally necessary, would still just be a nice touch, you know what I mean? And that's kind of it. I think that's Battle for Bikini Bottom is definitely a very, very smart, well done trip into nostalgia. If you really like the show, it definitely accentuates it, but even if you don't, I think it's a good, fun platformer for kids. I think it has a lot going for it in the same ways that it did back in the 2000s. Now, granted, the market is very different from the 2000s, where platformers were basically the king, and most of the big games on a lot of these consoles were platformers, if not early shooters, before, like, Halo sort of revolutionized that, and third-person shooters were revolutionized by Resident Evil 4 and then Gears of War after it. There's definitely been a long train of things changing, and I like to see this nice trend of platformers making a resurgence, which is exactly what they did here, and they delivered on it for the most part. As I said, they really did deliver on making this a fun, enjoyable experience, and I'm interested to see what Activision and Toys for Bob will do later this year with Crash 4, It's About Time. But until then, I'm Spray and Pray 1000. This has been The Verdict. Peace.